My presentation is about transformative learning. Transformation is a complex idea. We can ask many questions about who or what gets transformed, and there are many tools for looking at transformation. In this particular case, I'll be using dialectics as a tool for looking at transformation. And the context in which I'm going to be talking is learning about nutrition in 2 rural primary school classrooms in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. My name is Ingrid Schudel. I'm from the Environmental Learning Research Centre at Rhodes University, South Africa. So to start off with, why have I chosen dialectics as a tool? Education for Sustainable Development has a strong interest in social ecological change. We ask questions such as what should change, who should change, what change is good, and what enables and constrains change. Dialectic offers us an explanation of the movement and of the transformation of things. So it's a useful framework for explaining social ecological change. In this particular case, I draw on a Bhaskar-inspired critical realist dialectic to develop a dialectical process model of environmental learning for use in education for sustainable development. So let's take a look at this model. I call it a process model because as environmental educators, we know that no change can be prescribed or predetermined, and we need to think about change as an emergent process which gets developed and explored with learners through the educational process. So dialectics starts with a question asking, what is the nature of the world? What is the nature of the world into which we are born? And from looking at the world, we can see and we can uncover contradictions and we can uncover absences and problems and ills in the world. The next thing we need to do is to look at what as yet unrealized possibilities can we mobilize through our educational process. And Bhaskar calls that a process of absenting absences. Next, we need to look at, well, if we are going to propose or explore certain changes, we need to look at these holistically. In the critical realist dialectic, they call that totality, a need to focus on totality. And we can ask ourselves, what kind of false totalities are we experiencing? And what kind of compromises are we experiencing as individuals, as communities, or even what kind of compromises are we expecting the earth absorb through our actions and practices? And finally, once we have gone through these different levels, then we can consider transformative praxis. And that is looking for practically possible and morally defensible changes in a particular context. Any particular practice or change needs to be considered with all of these underlying layers, as well as for the specific context, the particular time and space in which we will be trying these out. So a reminder, it's a process model, it's a dialectical process model, and it's a critical realist process model. A little bit more about the context in which I'm going to be talking today. The rural Eastern Cape suffers from high levels of unemployment and financial insecurity. As you can see from the photograph on the right, we have an unhealthy and degraded soil, and currently we are experiencing a drought. Children at school have irregular access to meals from home, and often their meals are not as nutritious as they should be. You can see there's an inherent contradiction here with the South African Bill of Rights, which insists that all children have rights of access to food. Similarly, we find contradictions in the educational context. Our curriculum calls for a focus on human rights, inclusivity, environmental and social justice. And it also calls for encouraging an active and critical approach to learning rather than a rote and uncritical learning of given truths. However, in the Eastern Cape, we experience poor educational governance and mismanagement of the school feeding scheme that has been instigated in order to try and deal with the problems of poor nutrition in schools. So children are experiencing ill health, inability to concentrate in school, access to schooling is limited due to this ill health. And then more and more teachers are expecting to take on a pastoral role where they have to deal with these problems of nutrition and poverty amongst the learners that they work with in the schools. So let's take a look at a case of learning about nutrition in a primary school classroom, starting with the first level of our dialectic, what is the world into which we are thrown, and looking for contradictions and absences. So the teachers working with children did your standard educational activities around nutrition. On the left, you can see they looked at the food pyramid and they looked at the different types of food that we should be learning at the different levels of the food pyramid. There also, one of the teachers brought in vegetables and the children looked at wonderfully healthy homegrown vegetables and talked about the importance of vegetables in their diet. And then they also drew up menus about showing what one should eat in a day. So that was the one thing the teachers did. And then both of the teachers did an audit in the mathematics part of their day. They did an audit in terms of what the children were eating in this at home. So this is in INTEI Conference, what you see here. But what the teachers did was the first teacher asked them to color in a circle depending on what they ate for breakfast. And you'll see they have written things such as wheat bix, and there's porridge and bread, etc. But the interesting part is, or the worrying part is that some children, the purple circles, colored in INTEI Chapter, which means we did not eat. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see that the teacher did, another teacher also did an audit in terms of what people do, or what children eat in the homes, how often they drink water, how often they eat. And again, what came up was that some of the children were not getting regular meals at home. So there we have this inherent contradiction between what we are teaching in the classrooms and then what children are experiencing at home. You can't expect children to design a menu in terms of appropriate nutrition when they're not actually receiving anything to eat at all. So then the teachers started to look at what as yet unrealized possibilities they could mobilize, and they saw some very rich and nutritious school gardens and decided to try these in their own schools. So that was one of the things they tried to do. And so they needed to look at different ways of responding to nutrition, to the nutrition problem. The one was, first of all, they had to start with ecosystems, and they had to look at soil health, and they introduced things such as mulching to improve the capacity of the soil to grow plants. They also looked at social structures. One of the teachers had to organize social grants for the 3 children who said they were not receiving any breakfast, and that was to respond to the lack of finances for feeding children in the homes. Another teacher had to deal with social relations, where she had to address theft by the community in the garden that she started. At a personal level, the one teacher worked with lunchbox choices, helping children to make choices about what to put in their lunchbox. And that was obviously for the children who did have the luxury of choice. At the school level, as I mentioned, they both worked at food gardens to supplement the school feeding scheme. So let's look at the next level of the dialectic now, which is, are there any false totalities or compromises that are being made through the learning process here, or through the change that is being proposed? So the first one is to ask the question, what is the role of teachers in schools? I mentioned above that teachers are taking on more and more of a pastoral role. And academics in South Africa have raised the question, well, if teachers are spending so much time in their pastoral role, when do they actually get the time to teach? And this is potentially compromising the quality of teaching in the schools. The other question is, should children in school grow their own food? Should they be in the garden growing their own food, or should they be learning mathematics, language, learning science, etc.? And then another question is, it's all very well organizing social grants, but there are big structural problems and social problems in rural areas that also need to be addressed. We would like a healthy and thriving economy in the rural areas, rather than expecting people to rely on social grants for a living and in order to feed their children. So these are some of the challenges that we came across in these activities. So the next is to look at what transformative praxis did these teachers manage to achieve that was practically possible, morally defensible, and appropriate for their particular context. So the one important thing to acknowledge is that significant learning was achieved in both of the case studies. Mathematics was strengthened through the auditing that you saw a little bit earlier. Home language was strengthened through listening to stories about children and healthy eating. And life skills was also strengthened as children learned about plants and what plants need to grow. In the first case, so both of the teachers managed to achieve this, and then looking specifically at the different cases. In the first case, the teacher did manage to achieve better community support, and that was the community were no longer jumping over the fence to help themselves to vegetables, and this did become was discussed at the community level, and change was achieved there. She managed to plant a vegetable garden at the school, but unfortunately, the vegetables were stunted and it wasn't successful in supplementing the school feeding scheme because of the drought, because of technology breakdown. So, for example, the tractor which she tried to organize kept breaking down, and the ongoing problem with the poor soil. And this was despite efforts at mulching and addition of ostrich dung in order to try and improve the soil quality. Also, there was the scarcity of water during the drought, and water needed to be used for the children for drinking rather than in the gardens. In the second case, the teacher did also manage to plant a vegetable garden, and her garden was successful, and they managed to supplement the school feeding scheme through the garden. She managed to organize social grants for the 3 children mentioned earlier, and those children that did have the choice managed to pack different food in their lunch boxes. So you'll see that there were different challenges in context, and some successes and some ongoing questions that we still need to be asking. So looking at these different cases, let's think about the implications for transformative learning. The model, I would say, possesses powers for criticality without prescription. It asks us to think about things in the world that are not right, things that need to change, but those things that need to change are not predetermined or prescribed. It also offers us new visions, but these new visions are based on possibility. They're based on what is available in the world, what is possible in the world. And these new visions are also not idealistic or unrealistic. Seeing totality offers us a holistic perspective on change, because it makes us think about change and change practices from the perspective of individuals, of communities, and of the environment, ensuring that everybody and everything is taken into consideration when thinking about change. And also, if we look at the 4th level of the model, it ensures that any practice or any change that is instigated or supported is both grounded in reality as well as contextualized. Some further thoughts on the model are that it enables the strengthening of both rationality and wisdom. Rationality in the sense that it helps us to get a good sense and to look critically at what is there. And it also helps us to see the not yet seen. That is giving us the language of possibility. It also offers us possibilities for strengthening wisdom, because it insists on and it also supports the weighing of different options in our decision-making processes. Both of these are necessary to support the realization of, or the tendency to realize, one's ideas in practice, according to Bhaskar. But Bhaskar also tells us that to achieve true freedom, we need self-determination and autonomy. Now, if you look at young learners, we can see that they are a long way from being entirely autonomous in the world. And in fact, nobody is ever entirely autonomous, because we are influenced and guided by various powers, policies, and people in our lives. But especially young ones, we want to teach them that ultimately they will be taking responsibility in their world. But it's a slow process and it's a growing process. And there are different levels of autonomy that children take on. And I think Shipway gives us some interesting insights into then what it means to have a critical realist perspective on learning and in working with young learners. And he reminds us that teachers are the custodians of students' emancipation. So, in other words, while waiting for them to take on full autonomy in the world and to become self-determined as much as possible, ultimately we can still build on and strengthen their rationality and their wisdom through the work that we do in schools. So even at a young age, I think these processes and dialectical processes and thinking about transformation are important. It's important to start with these processes at any age so that our children become critical, reflexive participants in the world. So finally, if you'd like to read some more, here are some references, and thank you very much for your time.